Well, hello again. It's Monday, and so it must be time for me to record my weekly podcast. I'm Cory Doctorow, and this is the Cory Doctorow podcast. If there were music, it would go here, but I'm happy not to have any music. So what a great week I had last week. As I mentioned last week, I am now a year older than I was the last time I spoke to you. I have reached the ripe old age of 38. Which is kind of weird because I'm still thought of as, I guess, a young science fiction writer, new entrant to the field, at least by some. Great essay by John Scalzi explaining why that is, why by the time most young writers break in, they're in their early 30s. But I had a great birthday. We took the weekend off. My daughter's godmother stayed at our place. We got to go stay in a hotel, got to sleep in, and I got the best birthday present ever, which you may hear ticking away in the background. It's my brand new cuckoo clock, which I've always wanted, a completely elaborated, ridiculous confection of a cuckoo clock that it plays Edelweiss on the hour, and it has a man who drinks beer out of a little wooden stein, and a water wheel that goes around, and 4 dancing couples, as well as the obligatory cuckoo. It's nearly 10 a.m. Right now as I record this, so in about 10 minutes you will actually hear it cuckooing and playing Edelweiss. I'm going to leave that in this podcast just for you. That came from my beautiful and talented wife, Alice Taylor, who knew exactly what I wanted and got it for me. It's just perfect. I've just hung it up in the office. It was also kind of a sad week. Some friends and mentors in the science fiction field passed on this week. First, it was Charles N. Brown, sometimes known as Charlie Brown, the publisher, of course, and editor of Locus magazine. Locus, for whom I write a weekly column. I actually have to write a column, or 6 times a year column, rather. I have to write a column for them today, as it turns out, so I've got my mind on Charlie. He was a crotchety but grand old man who really let me have a lot of freedom when I wrote for him, and really let me push the envelope, and always supported me, and he will be very, very missed. Also passing on this week was Phyllis Gottlieb, called by some the mother of Canadian science fiction, really one of the grand old women of the field. And one of the few women from the early days of the field, a real brave pioneer who really gutted it out in a field that was dominated by men, and asserted her place in it, and a real inspiration to all of us. Phyllis was 82 when she went, and she was still a very active participant on the SF Canada mailing list, and still writing, and still mentally acute, and still just great. And so that, of all the ways to go, 82 still working is not a bad one, at least for a writer, but she is also very missed. And Phyllis was also extremely supportive and kind to all writers, including me. My first ever panel when I was 17 and had just sold my first story at the Ad Astra Science Fiction Convention, she sat next to me. And don't remember what the panel was about, but I remember how seriously she took me and how she treated me as a colleague, even though I was literally a kid, and she was one of the grand old women of the field. And I had dinner with her and her husband, Kelly, who's actually one of my dad's old physics professors from the University of Toronto, at Astra a few years ago when I was the guest of honor. And she was just as sweet and just as interesting and just as witty as she had been back then. So, Phyllis, you are also very missed. If you're in London at the end of the month, on July the 31st, I'm going to be speaking at the Mini Bar event at the Truman Brewery. This is a monthly event to talk about the future of free culture and publishing. I'm going to be talking a little about something you've heard me talk about here on the podcast, this With a Little Help short story collection. Also, if you're coming to Montreal for the World Science Fiction Convention, there'll be lots of chances for us to run into each other. There's a new thing. I think it started at the Denver Worldcon, which was the first one I'd missed in over a decade last year because we had a new baby. But the Denver Worldcon and the Montreal Worldcon have this thing called Walk with the Stars, where a group of science fiction writers and fans go for a morning walk. It's a lot healthier than the traditional Café Clutch, which I'm also going to do, which is a chance to sit around and eat donuts and drink coffee with a writer of your choice. But I hope you'll make it to one of those, or possibly to the reading. And I certainly hope I'll see you at the Hugo Awards. And I hope that I can walk out of there with a Hugo Award of my own or two under my arm. Although between you, me, and everyone else who listens to this podcast, most of us who are nominated for the novel have already agreed that we're going to hold down Neil Gaiman and take the award from him after he wins it. Neil was very kind and sent me a note telling me that he hoped that I won, which was very, very nice of him indeed. And speaking of Neil and his shtick, which is mostly graphic novels, although he's of course writing a lot of prose these days, I've had two different publishers approach me this week for graphic novel rights to Little Brother, both of whom are very, very good. I'm not going to name either of them, but it's the right kind of problem to have, to this kind of overflowing of riches. Well, that's the good and the bad from this last week, and without further ado, I'm going to read you a little more of Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, my 2005 Tor Books novel, shortly to be reprinted in the UK by HarperCollins UK. I think that'll be next summer. And in about 6 minutes, listen for Edelweiss and my new cuckoo clock. The mountain path had grown over with weeds and thistles and condoms and cans and inexplicable maxi pads and doll parts. She clung to his hands as he pushed through it, stepping in brackish puddles and tripping in sinkholes. He navigated the trail like a mountain goat, while Mimi lagged behind, tugging his arm every time she misstepped, jerking it painfully in its socket. He turned, ready to snap, "Keep the fuck up, would you?" then swallowed the words. Her eyes were red-rimmed and scared, her full lips drawn down into a clown's frown, bracketed by deep lines worn by other moments of sorrow. He helped her beside him and turned his back on the mountain, faced the road and the town and the car with its trunk, with its corpse, with his brother, and he put an arm around her shoulders, a brotherly arm, and hugged her to him. "How you doing there?" he said, trying to make his voice light, although it came out so leaden the words nearly thudded in the wet dirt as they fell from his mouth. She looked into the dirt at their feet, and he took her chin, and he turned her face up so that she was looking into his eyes, and he kissed her forehead in a brotherly way, like an older brother coming home with a long-lost sister. "I used to want to know all the secrets," she said, in the smallest voice. "I used to want to understand how the world worked, little things like heavy stuff goes at the bottom of the laundry bag, or big things like the best way to get a boy to chase you is to ignore him, or medium things like if you cut an onion under running water, your eyes won't sting, and if you wash your fingers afterwards with lemon juice, they won't stink. I used to want to know all the secrets, and every time I learned one, I felt like I'd taken a step on a journey to a place, a destination, to be the kind of person who knew all this stuff, the way everyone around me seemed to know all this stuff. I thought that once I knew enough secrets, I'd be like them." "I don't want to learn secrets anymore, Andrew." She shrugged off his arm and took a faltering step down the slope back toward the car. "I'll wait in the car, okay?" "Mimi," he said. He felt angry at her. How could she be so selfish as to have a crisis now, here, at this place that meant so much to him? "Mimi," he said, and swallowed his anger. His three brothers stayed on his sofa for a week, though they left only one wet towel on the floor, only left one sticky plate in the sink, one fingerprint-smudged glass on the counter. He just opened his first business, the junk shop, not yet upscale enough to be called an antique shop, and he was pulling the kinds of long hours known only to ER interns and entrepreneurs, showing up at 7 to do the books, opening at 10, working until 3, then turning things over to a minimum wage kid for 2 hours while he drove to the city's thrift shops and picked for inventory, then working until 8 to catch the evening trade, then answering creditors and fighting with the landlord until 10, staggering into bed at 11 to sleep a few hours before doing it all over again. So he gave them a set of keys and bought them a Metro Pass and stuffed an old wallet with $200 in 20s and wrote his phone number on the brim of a little pork pie hat that looked good on their head and turned them loose on the city. The shop had all the difficulties of any shop: snarky customers, shoplifting teenagers, breakage, idiots with jumpy dogs, never enough money, and never enough time. He loved it, every stinking minute of it. He'd never gone to bed happier and never woken up more full of energy in his life. He was in the world finally, at last, until his brothers arrived. He took them to the store the first morning, showed them what he'd wrought with his own 2 hands, thought that he'd inspire them to see what they could do when they entered the world as well, after they'd gone home and grown up a little, which they would have to do very soon, as he reminded them at every chance, unmoved by George's hangdog expression at the thought. They'd walked around the shop slowly, picking things up, turning them over, having hilarious, embarrassing conversations about the likely purpose of an old Soloflex machine, a grubby pink Epilady leg raiser, a Bakelite coffee carafe. The arguments went like this. George, look, it's a milk container. Ed, I don't think that's for milk. Fred, you should put it down before you drop it. It looks valuable. George, why don't you think it's for milk? Look at the silver inside. It's to reflect off the white milk and make it look, cold and fresh. Fred, put it down. You're going to break it. George, fine, I'll put it down, but tell me, why don't you think it's for milk? Ed, because it's a thermos container, and that's to keep hot stuff hot, and it's got a screw top, and whatever it's made of looks like it'd take a hard knock without breaking. And so on, nattering at each other like cavemen, puzzling over a Walkman, until Alan was called upon to settle the matter with an authoritative answer. It got so that he set his alarm for 4 a.m. so that he could sneak past their snoring form on the sofa, and so avoid the awkward, desperate pleas to let them come with him into the shop and catch a free breakfast of poutine and eggs from the Harveys next door while they were at it. George had taken up coffee on his second day in the city, bugging the other 2 until they got him a cup, 6 or 7 cups a day, so that they flitted from place to place like a hummingbird, thrashed in their sleep, babbled when they spoke. It came to a head on the 3rd night, when they dropped by the shop while he was on the phone, and ducked into the back room in order to separate into 3s again, with George wearing the pork pie hat even though it was a size too big for his head, and hung down around his ears. Adam was talking to a woman who'd come into the shop that afternoon and greatly admired an institutional sofa from the mid-70s whose lines betrayed a pathetic, slavish devotion to Danish modern aesthetics. The woman had sat on the sofa, admired the sofa, walked around the sofa, hand trailing on its back, had been fascinated to see the provenance he'd turned up, an inventory sticker from the University of Toronto Maintenance Department indicating that the sofa had originally been installed at the Robarts Library, itself of great and glorious aesthetic obsolescence. Oh my god, it appears to have a different song for 10 a.m. That was my knapsack on my back and not Edelweiss. Oh, I'm so happy. Sorry, back to the story. Here was Adam on the phone with this woman, closing a deal to turn a $3,000 profit on an item he'd acquired at the Goodwill As-Is Center for $5, and here were his brothers in the store, angry about something, shouting at each other about something. They ran around like 3 fat lunatics, reeking of the BO that they exuded like the ass end of a cow, loud, boorish, and indescribably weird. Weird beyond the quaint weirdness of his little curiosity show. Weird beyond the interesting weirdness of the punks and the goths and the mods who were wearing their subcultures like political affiliations as they strolled by the shops. Those were redeemable weirds, weirds within the bound of normal human endeavor. His brothers, on the other hand, were utterly, utterly irredeemable. He sank down behind the counter as George said something to Fred in their own little shorthand language, a combination of grunts and nonsense syllables that the 3 had spoken together for so long that he'd not even noticed it until they were taken out of their context and put in his. He put his back against the wall and brought his chest to his knees and tried to sound like he had a belly button as he said to the woman, "Yes, absolutely, I can have this delivered tomorrow if you'd like to courier over a check." This check, it was enough money to keep his business afloat for another 30 days, to pay his rent and the minimum wage kid and buy his groceries. And there were his brothers, and now Ed was barking like a dog, a rare moment of mirth from him who had been the sober outer bark since he was a child and rarely acted like the 17-year-old he was behaving like today. "Is everything all right?" she said down the phone. This woman, who'd been smartly turned out in a cashmere sweater and checked scarf over a pair of bootcut jeans that looked new and good over her designer shoes with little heels. They'd flirted a little, even though she was at least 10 years older than him, because flirting was a new thing for Alan, and he'd discovered that he wasn't bad at it. "Everything is fine," he said. "Just some goofballs out in the street out front. How about if I drop off the sofa for 6 o'clock? "Killed her, cut her up, sliced her open!" George screeched suddenly, skidding around the corner, rolling past him, yanking the phone out of the wall. And in that moment, he realized what the sounds they had been making in their private speech had been. They had been a reenactment, a grunting, squeaking playback of the day, the fateful day, the day he'd taken his knife and done his mischief with it. He reached for the phone cable and plugged it back into the wall, but as though his hand were moving of its own accord, because his attention was focused elsewhere, on the three of them arrayed in a triangle, as they had been on the hillside, as they had been when they had chanted him, when the knife grip was sure in the palm of his hands. The ritual, and that's what it was a ritual. The ritual had the feel of something worn smooth and by countless repetitions. He found himself rigid with shock, offended to his bones. This was what they had done now in the cave, with Davy sitting atop their mother, black and shriveled. This was how they behaved, running through this enactment of his great shame, of the day that Danny died. No wonder Darrell had terrorized them out of their home. They were beyond odd and eccentric. They were unfit for polite company, for human society. The phone in his hand rang. It was the woman. "You know, I'm thinking that maybe I should come back in with a tape measure and measure up the sofa before I commit to it. It's a lot of money, and to be honest, I just don't know if I have room. What if I measure it for you? I could measure it for you and call you back with the numbers." The three brothers stared at him with their identical, glassy, alien stares. "That's okay. I can come in." And he knew that she meant, "I won't ever come in again." "What if I bring it by anyway? I could bring it by tomorrow night, and you could see it, and make up your mind. No obligation." "That's very kind of you, but I'm afraid that I'll be out tomorrow evening." "Friday? I could come by Friday." He was trying to remember how to flirt now, but he couldn't. "I could come by and we could have a glass of wine or something." And he knew that he'd said exactly the wrong thing. "It's all right," she said coldly. "I'll come by later in the week to have another look. I have to go now. My husband is home." And he was pretty sure she wasn't married, but he said goodbye and hung up the phone. He looked at his solemn brothers now, and they looked at him. "When are you going home?" he said, and Edward looked satisfied, and Fred looked a little disappointed, and George looked like he wanted to throw himself in front of a subway, and his bottom lip began to tremble. "It was Ed's game," he said. "The Davy game. It was his." He pointed a finger. "You know, I'm not like them. I can be on my own. I'm what they need. They're not what I need." The other two stared at their fat bellies in the direction of their fat feet. Andrew had never heard George say that, had never even suspected that this thought lurked in his heart, but now that it was on the table, it seemed like a pretty obvious fact to have taken note of. All things being equal, things weren't equal. He was cold and numb. "That's a really terrible thing to say, George," is what he said. "That's easy for you to say," is what George said. "You are here. You are in the world. It's easy for you to say that we should be happy with things the way they are." George turned on his heel and put his head down and bulled out of the door, slamming it behind him so that the mail slot rattled and the glass shook, and a stack of nice melamine cafeteria trays fell off a shelf and clattered to the ground. He didn't come back that night. He didn't come back the next day. Ed and Fred held their grumbling tummies and chewed at the insides of their plump cheeks and sat on the unsold Danish modern sofa in the shop and freaked out the few customers that drifted in and then drifted out. "This is worse than last time," Ed said, licking his lips and staring at the donut that Albert had refused to feel guilty about eating in front of them. "Last time," he said, not missing Felix's quick warning glare at Ed, even though Ed appeared to. "He went away for a whole day, just disappeared into town. When he came back, he said that he needed some away time, that he'd had an amazing day on his own, that he wanted to come and see you, and that he'd do it whether we wanted to come or not." "Ah," Alvin said, understanding how the three had come to be staying with him. He wondered how long they'd last without the middle, without their ability to eat. He remembered holding the infant Eddie in his arms, the boy light and hollowed out. He remembered holding the three boys at once, heavy as a bowling ball. "Ah," he said, I'll have a word with him." When Greg came home, Alan was waiting for him, sitting on the sofa, holding his head up with one hand. Ellie and Fred snored uneasily in his bed, breathing heavily through their noses. "Hey," he said as he came through the door, scuffing at the lock with his key for a minute or two first. He was rumpled and dirty, streaked with grime on his jawline, and hair hanging limp and greasy over his forehead. "Greg," Alan said, nodding, straightening out his spine and listening to it pop. "I'm back," George said, looking down at his sneakers, which squished with grey water that oozed over his carpet. Art didn't say anything, just sat pat and waited, the way he did sometimes when con artists came to the shop with some kind of scam they wanted him to play along with. It worked the same with George. After a hard stare at his shoes, he shook his head and began to defend himself, revealing the things that he knew were indefensible. "I had to do it. I just had to. I couldn't live in that cave with that thing anymore. I couldn't live inside those two anymore. I'm going crazy. There's a whole world out here, and every day I get farther away from it. I get weirder. I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted to be like you. They stopped letting me into the clubs after I ran out of money, and they kicked me out of the cafes. I tried to ride the subway all night, but they threw me off at the end of the line, so I ended up digging a transfer out of the trash can and taking an all-night bus back downtown. No one looked at me twice that whole time, except to make sure that I was gone. I walked back here from Eglinton. That was 5 miles away, a good 40-minute walk in the night and the cold and the dark. Greg pried off his sneakers with his toes and then pulled off his gray, squelching socks. "I couldn't find anyone who'd let me use the toilet," he said, and Alan saw the stain on his pants. He stood up and took Greg by the cold hand, as he had when they were both boys, and said, "It's all right, Gord. We'll get you cleaned up and changed and put you to bed, okay? Just put your stuff in the hamper in the bathroom, and I'll find you a change of clothes and make a couple sandwiches, all right?" And just as easy as that, George's spirit was broken. He came out of the shower pink and steaming and scrubbed, put on the sweats that Adam found for him in an old gym bag, ate his sandwiches, and climbed into Adam's bed with his brothers. When he saw them again next, they were reassembled and downcast, though they ate the instant oatmeal with raisins and cream that he set out for them with gusto. "I think a bus ticket home is about $40, right?" Alan said as he poured himself a coffee. They looked up at him. Ed's eyes were grateful, his lips clamped shut. "And you'll need some food on the road, another $50 or $60, okay?" Ed nodded and Adam set down a brown $100 bill and then put a purple 10 on top of it. "For the taxi to the Greyhound station," he added. "Well, all right then. I'll talk to you next week. Hope you enjoyed it."